Quite another case, and having nothing to do with drink, was that of poor Captain B. He used to suffer from sick headaches in his young days every time he was approaching a coast. Well over 50 years of age when I knew him, short, stout, dignified, perhaps a little pompous, he was a man of singularly well-informed mind, the least sailor-like in outward aspect, but certainly one of the best seamen who it has been my good luck to serve under. He was a Plymouth man, I think, the son of a country doctor, and both his elder boys were studying medicine. He commanded a big London ship, fairly well known in her day. I thought no end of him, and that is why I remember with a peculiar satisfaction the last words he spoke to me on board his ship after an 18-months voyage. It was in the dock in Dundee, where he had brought a full cargo of jute from Calcutta. We had been paid off that morning, and I had come on board to take my sea chest away and to say good-bye. In his slightly lofty but courteous way, he inquired what were my plans. I replied that I intended leaving for London by the afternoon train, and thought of going up for examination to get my master's certificate. I had just enough service for that. He commended me for not wasting my time, with such an evident interest in my case that I was quite surprised. Then, rising from his chair, he said, "Have you a ship in view after you have passed?" I answered that I had nothing whatever in view. He shook hands with me and pronounced the memorable words, "If you happen to be in want of employment, remember that as long as I have a ship, you have a ship too." In the way of compliment, there is nothing to beat this from a ship's captain to his second mate at the end of a voyage, when the work is over and the subordinate is done with. And there is a pathos in that memory, for the poor fellow never went to sea again after all. He was already ailing when we passed St. Helena, was laid up for a time when we were off the Western Isles, but got out of bed to make his landfall. He managed to keep up on deck as far as the Downs, where, giving his orders in an exhausted voice, he anchored for a few hours to send a wire to his wife and take aboard a North Sea pilot to help him sail the ship up the east coast. He had not felt equal to the task by himself, for it is the sort of thing that keeps a deep-water man on his feet pretty well night and day. When we arrived in Dundee, Mrs. B. was already there, waiting to take him home. We travelled up to London by the same train, but by the time I had managed to get through with my examination, the ship had sailed on her next voyage without him, and instead of joining her again, I went by request to see my old commander in his home. This is the only one of my captains I have ever visited in that way. He was out of bed by then, quite convalescent, as he declared, making a few tottering steps to meet me at the sitting-room door. Evidently he was reluctant to take his final cross-bearings of this earth for a departure on the only voyage to an unknown destination a sailor ever undertakes. And it was all very nice, the large sunny room, his deep easy chair in a bow window, with pillows and a footstool, the quiet, watchful care of the elderly gentlewoman who had borne him 5 children, and had not, perhaps, lived with him more than 5 full years out of the 30 or so of their married life. There was also another woman there, in a plain black dress, quite grey-haired, sitting very erect on her chair with some sewing, from which she snatched side-glances in his direction, and uttering not a single word during all the time of my call. Even when, in due course, I carried over to her a cup of tea, she only nodded at me silently, with the faintest ghost of a smile on her tight-set lips. I imagine she must have been a maiden sister of Mrs. B., come to help nurse her brother-in-law. His youngest boy, a late-comer, a great cricketer it seemed, 12 years old or thereabouts, chattered enthusiastically of the exploits of W.G. Grace, and I remember his eldest son too, a newly fledged doctor, who took me out to smoke in the garden, and shaking his head with professional gravity, but with genuine concern, muttered, "Yes, but he doesn't get back his appetite. I don't like that." I don't like that at all." The last sight of Captain B I had was as he nodded his head to me out of the bow window when I turned around to close the front gate. It was a distinct and complete impression, something I don't know whether to call a landfall or a departure. Certainly he had gazed at times very fixedly before him with the landfall's vigilant look, this sea captain seated incongruously in a deep-backed chair. He had not then talked to me of employment, of ships, of being ready to take another command, but he had discoursed of his early days, in the abundant but thin flow of a wilful invalid's talk. The women looked worried, but sat still, and I learned more of him in that interview than in the whole 18 months we had sailed together. It appeared he had served his time in the copper ore trade, the famous copper ore trade of old days between Swansea and the Chilean coast, coal out and ore in, deep-loaded both ways, as if in wanton defiance of the great Cape Horn seas. A work, this, for staunch ships, and a great school of staunchness for West Country seamen. A whole fleet of copper-bottom barks, as strong in rib and planking, as well found in gear as ever was sent upon the seas, manned by hardy crews and commanded by young masters, was engaged in that now long defunct trade. That was the school I was trained in, he said to me almost boastfully, lying back amongst his pillows with the rug over his legs. And it was in that trade that he obtained his first command at a very early age. It was then that he mentioned to me how, as a young commander, he was always ill for a few days before making land after a long passage. But this sort of sickness used to pass off with the first sight of a familiar landmark. Afterwards, he added, as he grew older, all that nervousness wore off completely, and I observed his weary eyes gaze steadily ahead, as if there had been nothing between him and the straight line of sea and sky, where whatever a seaman is looking for is first bound to appear. But I have also seen his eyes rest fondly upon the faces in the room, upon the pictures on the wall, upon all the familiar objects of that home, whose abiding and clear image must have flashed often on his memory in times of stress and anxiety at sea. Was he looking out for a strange landfall, or taking, with an untroubled mind, the bearings for his last departure? It is hard to say, for in that voyage from which no man returns, landfall and departure are instantaneous, merging together into one moment of supreme and final attention. Certainly I do not remember observing any sign of faltering in the set expression of his wasted face, no hint of the nervous anxiety of a young commander about to make land on an uncharted shore. He had too much experience of departures and landfalls. And had he not served his time in the famous copper ore trade out of the British Channel, the work of the staunchest ships afloat and the school of staunch seamen?